Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to this morning's seminar. My name is Nick Pearce. I'm a Professor of Public Policy at the University of Bath and the Director of the Institute for Policy Research. And today's webinar, is to present the findings of some research that my colleagues Dr. Rita Griffiths and Dr. Marsha Wood have conducted at the Institute on council tax reduction and universal credit, winners and losers of the postcode lottery. It's a relatively under-researched area. The IFS has done some recent work in this area, but I don't believe there's much in the way of qualitative research, which Rita and Marsha will be able to explain and discuss, and as well as work with local authorities and others who operate council tax reduction schemes. So important new research, I think, here to present to you this morning. We'll have an opportunity for some Q&A. I think my colleague Amy has put in the chat that if you wish to ask a question at the end of the presentation, do so into the Q&A section, and we'll pick those questions up and we'll put them to Rita and Marsha, and we'll have a discussion about the report. So plenty of time for questions, plenty of time for discussion. So again, welcome this morning. I'm going to now hand over, I think, to my colleague Rita Griffiths, who's going to introduce the research. Rita, over to you.
Thanks, Nick. Good to be here this morning. So Marsha, if you could move the first slide forward, thanks. Okay, so what is council tax reduction? It's often called also council tax support. So the two terms are used interchangeably. So it's a means-tested reduction or a discount on council tax for low-income people of working age who are eligible for the support, and that's for people who are both in and out of work in the same way as universal credit. And there are really strong linkages between council tax reduction now and universal credit. So it was introduced in 2013, just as universal credit began rolling out, and it replaced what was previously a national government scheme called council tax benefit, which was designed centrally but administered and delivered locally by local authorities. By contrast, council tax reduction is designed and delivered by local authorities, and the intention is that local authorities, councils have the flexibility to design schemes that meet their own local needs and priorities. And it was introduced as part of the devolution agenda, giving flexibility to local and regional governments. So we're focusing specifically on schemes in England for this particular piece of research. And as of 2025-26, there were 313 schemes operating in England, so a huge number of schemes, and also separate schemes in Scotland and Wales. They have retained a national scheme similar to the former council tax benefit that we're not actually covering Scotland and Wales as part of this research, just focusing on England. Northern Ireland doesn't actually have council tax, so that's not included either. And the important difference with council tax reduction compared with the previous council tax benefit is that each scheme has its own separate application processes, their own eligibility criteria, and different ways of assessing entitlement, so that the rules attached to schemes are highly variable dependent on where people live. So the notion of a postcode lottery. And also important to note is that the variability in the schemes has actually increased over time as well, as councils have tweaked and changed their schemes. Can we have the next slide, please, Marsha? So we can divide council tax reduction schemes into three main types. So default or legacy schemes, sometimes called traditional schemes, that still comprise the majority of councils, so around about 2/3, although this number is falling. This proportion is falling. And this is largely based on the former scheme, the former council tax benefit. And under these schemes, entitlement for support is tapered away as earnings increase. And most use the same taper that formerly applied, so that's 20%. But some have increased this, and some councils have reduced it over time. The problem with these schemes is that they're very prone to volatility if earnings or income changes, even by a very small amount. And that's, of course, been exacerbated by universal credit, which is assessed monthly. So can be very variable from month to month for people. So in order to overcome some of that volatility, increasingly councils are looking to introduce income banded schemes. So around about a third of schemes are currently income banded across England. And in these schemes, the reduction in support is actually stepped over a series of income bands, which correspond then to a particular percentage discount on the council tax. So, for example, 75%, 50%, 25%. And the idea is that small changes in income within these income bands would not change entitlement of council tax reduction. So it's designed to give more stability for claimants. So they're generally less volatile, and they give people more surety over what their entitlement is likely to be. This is assuming that the people's income does not change within the bands. Discount schemes are a different type of scheme altogether. They weren't included in our research because they tend to apply to a very small number of councils. And here the discount operates much more like the single person's discount. So it's just, it's based on household type, receipt of a qualifying benefit, so they tend not to be means tested in the same way. And it's based often on self-declared earnings, operating quite independently of universal credit. So quite simple to administer for councils and to understand, but also because it's based on self-declared earnings, they can be more prone to error and fraud. But as I say, we didn't cover these in this piece of research. Can we have the next screen, please, Marsha? So one of the differences in council tax reduction, as I said, is the huge variability in the scheme rules. So who gets it, how much they get, is massively variable depending on where people live. So, for example, whether people are even entitled to receive the reduction. Some councils apply the £16,000 limit of universal credit, the upper limit. Some apply the lower limit of £6,000. The minimum amount that people have to pay in council tax can vary from nothing, where there is 100% support, up to 60% in some areas. So the maximum support, the 40%. So big differences here. Also in default schemes, the size of any taper of earnings can vary. Although most people have 20%, most councils have 20%, they can vary between 15 and 40%. And also the size of any earnings disregard, so the amount of money that people can earn before their entitlement is tapered away. Some councils have no earnings disregard, others can have up to £25 per week, depending on people's circumstances. And then in income banded schemes have to determine which elements of income is counted and which is disregarded. So some schemes include the whole universal credit award as income. Some earnings only schemes actually disregard the entire award. What counts as income within universal credit also varies. So the different elements of universal credit, such as payments for housing, payments for carers, payments for people who have disabilities or long-term health conditions, whether there are any payments for childcare costs, and also transitional protection for people moving from legacy benefits into universal credit. All these different elements of universal credit can be treated very differently. In some schemes, they are included, in some people as income, in some schemes that are disregarded. The same applies to disability benefits outside of universal credit, such as personal independence payment and disability living allowance. Also carers allowance. Some schemes include them as income, some people disregard them. Some include child benefits as income, which is very unusual in previous legacy schemes and tax benefits. Child benefit was always disregarded, but in some councils it's treated as income, or more confusingly, they might treat it as income for different numbers of children or different ages of children. The minimum income floor for self-employed claimants also. Some people use the universal credit definition, some people have their own, some people disregard it altogether, they use actual income. Some councils also use different household types, so the number of adults, the number and ages of children, and they might also use the council tax band that is applying as well to determine entitlement. So huge variation, quite complicated, and giving rise to potentially huge differences in entitlement for people with otherwise similar levels of income and circumstances. Up to £125 a month has been measured by the IFS and the Resolution Foundation. So truly a postcode lottery. Next slide, please, Marsha. Also highly variable are the links between council tax reduction and universal credit. So virtually all recipients of council tax reduction are now on universal credit, but of course the reverse is not true. Not everybody who gets universal credit is entitled to council tax reduction. So details of the Universal Credit Award now goes to all councils and is updated on a daily basis. So they have a huge amount of information available about how much people are awarded, what elements are awarded, how much income people have, but what councils actually do with that data is highly variable. Some councils have actually automated the application process for council tax reduction. So they've taken the savings and income data and applied it automatically so that people don't have to apply separately. But most councils require people to make a separate application for council tax reduction and also requires separate documentary evidence of income and earnings as well. So people having to upload their wage slips and bank statements and so on. And as the previous slide went through, different disregards which elements of universal credit are treated as income and which aren't. So a highly complex picture. Every scheme is different. As one of our respondents quoted, they've created an absolute monster. Next slide, please, Marsha. So the aim of our research was to try, in some way, to try and unpack all of this complexity, to explore in particular how people with earnings, whether that's through self-employment or through paid work, how they're affected by and how they respond to these different schemes. In particular, looking at issues of take-up, so the extent to which different application process were affecting that, and the way in which it was affecting household finances and also the decisions that people are making around work. So the way in which these schemes are affecting work incentives. Next slide, please. So the way in which we did this, we had an online survey that was self-completed online, and it was accessed by people going on to an online benefit calculator operated by Entitled To, who very usefully provided the link on the platform. And from this 160, we conducted telephone interviews with a further 30 respondents to find out in more depth what their experiences were of getting or claiming council tax reduction when they were earning. We also conducted interviews with local authority officers and people in organisations that had extensive knowledge of council tax reduction schemes in England. And we conducted the research between May and October 2025. So next slide, please. So what did we find? So in our key informant findings, local authorities are meant to be designing schemes to meet their local needs and priorities. That was a reason for their introduction. But of course, funding pressures have been the main driver of scheme design. So improving work incentives has tended to take a back seat as financial pressures on councils have intensified. So because council tax reduction is not ring-fenced, so unlike the scheme for people of state pension age, there is no statutory ring fencing of this funding. So local authorities have had to make some hard choices and trade-offs in terms of winners and losers as their funding has been constrained. And most councils have tended to focus the highest levels of support on the poorest households and the most vulnerable households in which somebody earns have therefore increasingly lost out. So sometimes the taper rate has increased, earnings disregards have reduced or been removed altogether. In many councils now, entitlement is reduced or removed at very low levels of earnings. So as soon as somebody moves into a job, the entitlement for council tax reduction is removed or tapered away very quickly. And also there have been year-on-year freezes in income thresholds, which has had the effect of limiting entitlement. So, quote from an informant here, we're supposed to consider work incentives. The reality for most local authorities is that the design of schemes are financially driven, and usually there isn't enough money. Therefore, your protections tend to go towards those without work because they're deemed to be more vulnerable than people in work. And what's happening is that as council tax has increased, as pressure on family budgets have increased, people in work are finding council tax increasingly more unaffordable, and levels of arrears are increasing. And somebody described this as a kind of doom loop. So as council tax support has been eroded, driving up levels of arrears, which has reduced council tax reduction rates, and also, again, reduced funding available for the schemes, which again results in further cuts in help. So not benefiting anybody. Next screen, please. Marsha, thank you. So our informants are telling us that universal credit does not map well onto council tax reduction, that neither of the schemes design, the two different designs we looked at, function smoothly with universal credit. So in default legacy schemes, as I mentioned, the smallest change in income or earnings can actually trigger a reassessment of council tax reduction. And each time this happens, the council is obliged to reissue a change notification, letting people know what their changing entitlement and eligibility is, and also the changing payment regime for council tax, often having to change direct debits. And this can happen up to 12 times a year if people's earnings are changing. And of course, it's creating huge volatility for claimants, but also huge costs for councils as well. So councils, in an effort to remove some of that volatility and administrative cost, have increasingly moved to income banding, but they create problems of themselves, particularly in relation to the cliff edges around the income thresholds. This can happen when people's incomes are on the thresholds of bands, or if their universal credit fluctuates because their earnings fluctuate, or for other reasons. Also having to decide which elements of income are counted can actually open councils up to legal challenges, and increasingly councils are being taken to court. So we've got Trafford Council, Croydon, Three Rivers, and likely to be Somerset, have all been challenged in the High Court with the claimants' complaints being upheld, and they've had to compensate and change their schemes. So quite difficult for councils to redesign schemes in a way that does not discriminate against protected groups. And both types of schemes can create financial penalties to work and earning more. So these are precisely the kind of disincentives to work that universal credit were meant to eliminate. And it all comes down to the way in which monthly assessment impacts on council tax reduction month to month. We have the next slide, please. Thanks. So I'm going to move over to Marsha now, who's going to talk about our findings in relation to what claimants were telling us.
So hi everyone, so I'm just going to go through some of the findings from the survey and the qualitative interviews that we did with the universal credit claimants. We found that almost half of the survey respondents said that they found it difficult to apply for council tax reduction, and when we asked them a bit more in the survey about their kind of reasons for that, Many said that they were unaware of, they found it really hard to find information about their local schemes. They said the application processes were really onerous. They faced a lot of issues with providing or uploading documentary evidence to online platforms, and they also mentioned limited support and poor communication. So similarly, around half said that getting council tax reduction while they were on universal credit had been terrible or quite bad. And they mentioned issues around the administrative burden, around having to verify their identification and proving evidence of their income. Delays in assessment was an issue that came up quite a lot. The issue about variable monthly entitlements and the sheer sort of low amount of council tax reduction that they were receiving. And also the reduction in or loss of council tax reduction they were working or when they were increasing their earnings. For those who had more positive experiences, they mentioned kind of more simple and sometimes automated application processes. They talked about having more relatively high and stable council tax reduction amounts and the automated assessment of income linked to their universal credit claim. But overall, kind of few actually understood really how their sort of council tax reduction interacted with the universal credit or by how much their discount would change if they earned more. So we also asked about council tax reduction and the affordability of their council tax. So we found that in spite of getting the council tax reduction, most were still struggling to pay their council tax. So 76% of those who were receiving council tax reduction at the time of the survey were struggling, compared with 86% of those who were no longer entitled but had received it in the past. And a large share were in council tax arrears. So 44% of those currently receiving council tax reduction were in arrears, and 56% who were no longer entitled were in arrears. And the average amount that people owed in arrears was £1,490. We also found around a third said that the amount of council tax reduction they had to pay varied each month, and that obviously made it really difficult for them to budget, and it was quite difficult for them to manage. But overall, we found that, like, regardless of how much they got, almost all respondents said that the council tax reduction was really important to them, and that any help was better than none, because they were obviously operating with such kind of low disposable incomes that it was really difficult to afford high council tax bills. So any help was kind of better than not getting any at all. And then, so sort of more into the qualitative interviews, we asked people about the kind of financial impacts of getting council tax reduction, and what came out here a lot was the kind of like the differences that people face. So we're just going to talk through some of the different examples. But one of the key things we found that many were kind of shocked by how much the council tax reduction fell when they started work or started earning more. So we've got an example here from Zara, who, when she was unemployed, she received a council tax reduction of £1,100 off a £1,900 council tax bill. But then when she moved into minimum wage part-time work, this reduction fell to £300. So a huge difference when she moved into work. And Rebecca similarly found that her council tax was discounted by 100% when she was unemployed, but then she had to pay full council tax work when she started minimum wage part-time work. And in another example, we had Naomi, who moved house, and she found that she was required to pay full council tax of £148 per calendar month compared with £60 previously, even though for her council tax band and income had not changed. They'd not changed at all. And I've got a quote here from Naomi. She said, "It's a bit of a shocker. In Council C, I'd be paying around £60 a month for council tax. Here, I'm not going to get any discount whatsoever, and my income hasn't gone up a penny." And we also had a lone parent in one council who earned £500 per calendar month and was not entitled to council tax reduction, while a lone parent in a different council who earned £1,900 per calendar month actually received reduction worth £109 per calendar month. So even though their circumstances were very similar, it's a big difference. And these kind of differences have also been found in research by the Institute for Fiscal Studies and Resolution Foundation. And so we also asked about the kind of interaction between council tax reduction and universal credit. So we found for some that moving to universal credit from the legacy benefits or tax credits, so even within the same council and without any change of income, could trigger a big drop in their council tax reduction entitlement. So as this participant said, when we were getting tax credits, the disability living allowance was disregarded, even though it's exactly the same council. it's 1,600 I've got to pay now. And another issue that came up with a number of our participants was around the fluctuating monthly earnings, or being on the edge of an income band, and how that could affect their council tax, which could mean a substantial reduction and leaving them worse off. So this participant said, I was on the cusp of a band, so if I got a penny more, it pushed me into less support. So earning £366, you get nothing, £365 and you get 25% off. It's too inflexible, you need predictability, you need to budget. So, and another issue was around just the sort of misalignment between the sort of monthly assessment and arrears calculation of universal credit, but then the liability for council tax being calculated for the month ahead. So that created another challenge. This participant said, I guess a letter every month, which is based on last month's earnings, then that's applied for the month going ahead. It's really confusing. And then, so we also asked about how council tax reduction was affecting people's work-related decisions. And so we found that there did seem to be an impact here. So there was a reduction in or loss of council tax when earning meant that some were better off when claiming out of work benefits. So as this participant said, when I wasn't working, I was better off than I am now because the rent was paid, the council tax was paid. When you're working, there's just nothing there. And then I have to pay £130 council tax. This could disincentivize sort of higher earnings for some. As this person said, it almost puts you off wanting to work more. And some who said that who did have the option to reduce their hours said they were better off by doing this. So this person said the best really that you can do is work minimum hours, because that's how it balances really. Although for many, work conditionality rules meant that reducing work hours wasn't really an option, so they just had to kind of face up to the council tax. So if you're not looking for work, you get a sanction. So we just go to work, but if we didn't go to work, we'd be financially better off. And we also asked claimants if they had any suggestions for how things could be improved. And the most common suggestion really was just having higher entitlements to council tax reduction, especially when working, or increasing their earnings. And if there could be a way to have longer sort of periods of stable and reliable council tax reduction awards, so they weren't dealing with changes all the time. Some suggested entitlement run-ons when their circumstances changed. And people wanted sort of improved or more automated application processes and income assessment. Better support and communication was also suggested by several. And when asked if it would help if council tax reduction was integrated within universal credit, views were quite mixed. So some wanted to revert to direct payments, as had been the case in council tax benefit for those who are unemployed or non-earning. But many were sort of reticent about that because there was a risk of spending the council tax element of other things. So with so many competing demands on the payment, and then there kind of was a fear of council tax arrears and enforcement. So I'm going to hand back to Rita now. Who's going to continue the rest of the slides. Hi, Rita.
Thanks so much for that.
Yeah. Okay.
So then to summarise our findings, we didn't find any strong evidence that localising council tax reduction in England is actually working any better than the former council tax benefit scheme. So it was intended to give local authorities the flexibility to devise locally responsive schemes, but funding pressures have actually removed their ability to do that largely. And what's happened is that these pressures have meant less help as people move into work and as their earnings increase. And this in turn is driving levels of council tax arrears and financial hardship among people who are in work. Still entitled to universal credit on the grounds of low income, but either entitled to very low levels of council tax support or losing entitlement altogether. So what's also become very clear in the research is this clear tensions between the design, excuse me, of council tax reduction schemes and, excuse me, the aims of universal credit. So the monthly variability potentially caused by monthly assessment in universal credit and the cliff edges potentially an entitlement for council tax reduction are actually undermining the work incentive aspects of universal credit, so that moving into work and earning more doesn't necessarily pay, which is against one of the fundamental aims of universal credit. But also important is the burden that's placed on local authorities to design and constantly redesign schemes to meet local needs and priorities, and the way in which this has potentially opened them up to the risk of legal challenge. They're essentially delivering their own social security schemes, which are very complex, difficult to design and administer, and it's a huge responsibility on local authorities. Also, in terms of the bigger picture, is that this huge diversity in eligibility and entitlement rules is actually undermining key features of social security historically, which is around entitlement based on need, and also just fairness and consistency for people in similar circumstances. And we had a quote from one of our respondents. It's almost like you franchise something. Can you go in one and you get a different level, you get one level of service and you'd expect it in another, but that franchise is run differently. And this shouldn't be the case when you're dealing with people's lives, when you're dealing with people's finances and whether they can afford their bills. So there is clearly a need for reform, but how do we go about that? What are the options? We could have next slide, thanks. So essentially there are three main options. So retaining a locally devolved system of council tax reduction, but with the government having greater mandating and prescription in terms of certain aspects of the schemes. Some people have called for reintroduction of a national council tax reduction scheme. I believe Resolution Foundation has come out in favour of that. So it would be designed centrally in the same way as council tax benefit was, and also administered locally by local authorities, very similar to how the scheme works for people of state pension age. There's a further proposal, which has been put forward by the IFS, the Institute of Fiscal Studies, to integrate council tax support within the Universal Credit Award. So just looking at each of those separately. So if a locally designed scheme was retained, this would take off all the, or help to take off the hard edges and the unfairness of the current system. So, for example, the government could mandate certain disregards in relation to disability and child and carer-related benefits and payments. So, for example, child benefit or the disabled element of universal credit, childcare payments within universal credit, personal independence payment, and so on, carers allowance. They could mandate councils to have the same taper rate in default schemes or the same earnings disregard. So the advantage of this would be that there would be greater consistency and fairness across councils in England, and addressing the worst aspects of localism, and also bringing the schemes into closer alignment with universal credit as well. It would also allow councils to have some choice over the design in their areas, but it would reduce the risk of legal challenge in terms of protected groups. Against this is that for income-banded schemes, there are huge technical complications around how income would be treated in such schemes. So not technically straightforward to do this. Next slide, please, Marsha. So the benefits of reintroducing a national scheme, clearly greater fairness and consistency. It would make no difference which local council area you lived in. The scheme would be the same across England. And it would be less complex for councils as well. They wouldn't have to keep constantly redesigning their schemes and having responsibility for that. Against the reintroduction of a national scheme, inevitably there are going to be winners and losers. So, so claimants who live in areas where the schemes are more generous are likely to lose out. It's also likely to be more expensive than the current system. I think the IFS have done some costings around this. But inevitably, a national scheme will cost more than the current system. And then there is also the loss of councils' flexibility and design choice that they have at the moment. There is a way of mitigating some of that by boosting funding through schemes that councils do have control over, like the Crisis and Resilience Fund. So there are ways in which that loss of local control could actually be mitigated. And then thirdly, integrating support for council tax within universal credit, which has been proposed by the Institute of Fiscal Study. So the benefit of this is it would address some of the worst effects of problems with work incentives. So it would be a more smooth withdrawal of council tax support as income rises, helping to improve work incentives. It would also help to improve take-up because the process of applying for council tax would be automatic. So because it would be, the support would be integrated within universal credit, there would be no need for a separate application. And so take-up rates would automatically increase. And also reducing the administrative burden, both for claimants who no longer have to provide evidence of income and earnings and savings, but also reducing that burden for councils as well. Against it, how technically feasible is it to actually do this? It's probably only achievable alongside a national scheme. So this is like a really big change to the current system. And then one of the biggest risks is just the fact that there is a potential that council tax arrears could increase, collection rates could reduce if the amount of money that people were awarded in their universal credit was actually spent on other things than council tax, or it might be the amount might be lost if, for example, the universal credit payment was subject to deductions or to sanctions. So there is a concern, particularly among councils, but also among claimants themselves, that that the money would be spent on something else. And the experience of councils as regards the housing element being integrated within universal credit didn't bode well, they said, for how what might happen if a council tax support went the same way. So the next slide. So where does that leave us? So as with all research, further work is needed to kind of flesh out all these different options, particularly the way in which they impact differently on the incentive to move into work and also to increase earnings. Something that could improve things significantly for councils that haven't already done so would be to automate the application process for council tax reduction. They have all the data necessary for new claimants. It's easier for some councils to do it than others, depending on the kind of software systems that they have. And obviously there are costs attached to that, but that would make a huge difference in terms of take-up rates. Also, in the short to medium term, better alignment could be brought about between council tax reduction policies and universal credit, for example, around savings limits and income and earnings disregards. The range of data that's provided to councils by the Department for Work and Pensions through their universal credit data share, that could be increased. But at the moment it focuses for new claims. There's more information available there rather than for existing claimants. If that was expanded, then it would be easier to extend council tax reduction to existing claimants as well as new ones. But also there is a need to look at reviewing council tax reduction as part of the ongoing review of universal credit. Ultimately, however, it all comes down to funding. At the end of the day, to have a system, however it's designed, it to be fair and consistent, that it protects the poorest and most vulnerable people, and also offers decent work incentives, but is simple, both for claimants and councils, and efficient. It's going to require an appropriate level of funding. So there are important decisions that need to be made here by central government. So thank you so much for listening. Our report and policy brief are now live online, and we're happy to take any questions that you might have.
Many thanks, Rita. Many thanks, Marsha, for that excellent presentation of the research. And we have a couple of questions in the chat, which I'll put to you, and then perhaps we can take some more. The first one, I think, Marsha, you covered this in your section on the qualitative research, but a question from Salma that was really regarding how aware people are of different rules in different areas, how it differs across areas, and in particular, the relevance of that for UC claimants who are more likely to change addresses. I think you said there was very low awareness of how the different local authorities run different schemes.
Yeah. So yeah, we did find there was, generally some people we found were not aware of it, partly because they kind of thought, well, they weren't aware that something was available for people who were in work, but also people were much more aware of kind of like the single person discount, so the 25% discount. So there's more awareness around that, but there didn't necessarily seem to be a link to people receiving that and then being made aware of, the additional discounts that might be available. But yeah, generally it didn't seem to be that obviously aware, there wasn't a great awareness for people, but different for people who are obviously in schemes where it's maybe more, automated and councils where it was being automatically done for them. That was, a very different experience for those that we spoke to.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, I think most people in our research just found out about it by accident. Either talking to somebody else, seeing something through social media, or when they were going on to a benefits calculator, which is obviously how we captured our sample. There seemed to be very little marketing that they were aware of that was done by their own council. And I think separate research that's been done by Policy and Practice just shows that council tax support is one of the most underclaimed benefit across the piece. So there are generally low levels of awareness and a lot of misunderstanding that it's only available for people who aren't working.
I wonder, did you find in any of your interviews with local authorities any suggestion that local authorities have been able to use the devolution of previous council tax benefit national policy to do better things at a local level, to get some advantage from localism? Was there any evidence of that in your interviews?
Absolutely. There is a huge amount of goodwill out there from local councils. Although a lot of people are really struggling, there were examples of good practice, particularly around automating applications for universal credit. So some councils, as soon as somebody's made a claim for universal credit that's resident in their area, they get the data through, and they did the claim automatically without people even necessarily knowing that they were entitled to council tax reduction. It was done behind the scenes, as it were, and that was hugely beneficial for people. Not only did they not have to apply for it, but they were getting this extra this discount that they wouldn't otherwise have been aware of. So that's made a huge difference, and there's a lot of councils that have gone to a huge amount of effort as well to try and raise awareness. So there are examples of good practice across the piece, but of course, at the end of the day, it comes down to funding, and where funding has been reduced and being squeezed, they have to make cuts somewhere, and inevitably, it's people who have some additional level of income above benefits that tend to be the areas where they have to cut.
Yeah, thank you, Rita. So another question from Adele Atkinson, which is asking whether people having to apply, quite high levels of numeracy to their personal finances and to working out what they might be entitled to from council tax benefit and the interaction with UC, and asking, do you see any sign that some people struggle to do that? They can't make the necessary calculations. or avoid considering the implications just because of the complexity of it all? I mean, it's a standard problem, I suppose, with means testing, but particularly in this instance with the interaction of different benefits.
Yes, I mean, this is what income-banded schemes were meant to try and overcome. They were trying to make it more transparent. So because these bands are published by councils, they are publicly available, so people can look at what the implication would be if they just earned a few more pounds. So that's for income-banded schemes. So we're intended to make it easier for people to make these decisions. But of course, 2/3 of schemes still apply a taper, and it's virtually impossible for people to work out. Somebody in our research, it's in our report, said, would have needed to be Stephen Hawkins to actually work out the difference that working a few more hours made. And people often found out what difference it made by changing their hours or changing jobs, and then suddenly finding themselves worse off because they'd lost so much entitlement to council tax reduction. So what they were getting in one hand, in their universal credit and earnings, they were kind of losing in the loss of council tax reduction. But it's very hard to actually calculate what that's going to be.
Yeah, sure. So we have a question from Chris Wolford, which is, what's the government view? I suppose the issue here is that council tax reduction schemes are the responsibility of the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government, whereas obviously universal credit is with Department for Work and Pensions. And therefore, classic problem of trying to get different departments to talk to each other about these, the sort of systemic effects of these kinds of policies, which are operated separately. But I wonder, is there any indication from government about any appetite for reform in this area?
I think there definitely is an appetite for reform, and the recent child poverty strategy actually specifically mentioned council tax reduction and places a requirement on local authorities to consider ways in which their schemes actively work to reduce child poverty in their areas. And we've had some early discussions with colleagues in the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government. They're very keen to look at how improvements can be made. But of course, it all comes down to funding again at the end of the day, is how, and also just, technically how a big change, so introducing a new national scheme would be a huge undertaking, how that is actually going to be achieved. I think realistically would be for the government to kind of prescribe or mandate these sort of key areas of disregards and so on would be the way forward, because that's relatively straightforward to do, is to have consistency across councils in England for the government to say council tax benefit should always be disregarded, for example, or personal independence payment, disability living allowance, child maintenance. These are areas that the government could quite easily say, we want all councils to make sure that they disregard these items as income.
Yes, I'm just looking in the chat because I think this may be from England, the DWP. Which elements of UC were councils more likely to disregard if they did disregard any, and were some more or less likely to make a difference between the means-tested or non-means-tested benefits in terms of the disregard? So from the research, were there, which benefits were more likely to be disregarded, and was there any difference between universal and means-tested?
Yeah, I think in reality, the things that were most likely to be disregarded or not, it often came down to the sort of technical capability of the software. And I think this has come out in some of the legal challenges, that councils in their defence, when they've been taken to court, have said our software or administrative systems have not allowed us to disregard. So a good example would be sort of carers allowance and the carers element of universal credit. They were challenged on the double counting of this, and it was upheld. But the defence of the council was concerned was that our system double counts. We can't, that's just how it deals with this income. So I think there are technical constraints. In other cases, it's been down to the kind of political leanings of a council. So some of them have looked to kind of address some of the worst aspects of universal credit as they see it. So, for example, what is seen as the unfairness of the minimum income floor. Some councils have said we're actually going to treat the actual income of the self-employed person rather than at a deemed level of earnings within universal credit, because clearly, patently, they don't have that money available to pay their council tax. It's not in our interest to do the same thing there. So yeah, different kind of reasons for why they would disregard or include certain levels of income, but some actually include the whole of the award as income. Some local authorities, whereas others disregard the whole of the amount.
Yeah, so huge variation there. There's just another comment from Chris Wolford saying, isn't it a problem for council finance officers that you've got this volatility and uncertainty from universal credit, which is then leading to changes in council tax benefit awards, and they can't plan at a local level as a consequence of that? I don't know if you picked any of that up in the research.
I mean, there are ways of overcoming that without necessarily introducing income banding. So, for example, and it has been done in some local authority areas, they just basically make a decision that whatever the award is, it holds for 3 months or 6 months, and regardless of any change in income over that period of time. Some of them have also had a sort of de minimis rule as well. So any change of income, so sort of similar to income banding, but in a traditional sort of tapered scheme, they said, for argument's sake, any change in earnings that's less than £10 a month or £20 a month, we will disregard. So there are ways that councils can overcome it, and these are examples of good practice. But not everybody introduces those. A lot of it as well comes down to administrative ease for councils as well, because obviously an automated system that just does these changes automatically means less staffing resource.
Yes, indeed. I suppose one other addition to your incremental reform agenda might be that in addition to national specification of guidelines on what to disregard and so on, particularly compatibility with UC in terms of work incentives, to think about local authorities in adjacent areas, particularly those that fall underneath combined authorities or strategic authorities, as they all in England will in the course of time, whether they begin to integrate at the sort of sub-regional level their different schemes. So you still, of course, have borders between people in different local authorities, but you might sort of overcome some of the problems of moving within a combined authority area because each of the local authorities had integrated what they were doing. So at the level of, say, the West of England, it would be the West of England Combined Authority for local authorities running the same council tax reduction scheme, minimising some of the problems with people moving within that sub-region. I suppose that's an additional element we might consider here for the incremental agenda you specify, Rita, Marsha.
Absolutely. I mean, the reorganisation of local government will see, inevitably, we'll see a reduction in the number of council tax reduction schemes, I think, as unitary authorities take responsibility for a much bigger catchment area. So there are some real opportunities, I think, to kind of rationalise some of these schemes and to do away with some of the worst effects of localism across the sort of redrawn boundaries of unitary authorities. So yeah, that's a new opportunity, definitely.
Great. Well, as we have no other questions that I can see in the Q&A, and we're coming to the end of our hour, thank you very much indeed, Rita. Thank you, Marsha, for presenting your research. It's available, as Rita was saying, on the website. So the full report is on the IPR website. If you Google Bath Institute for Policy Research, you'll see it there. And we'll be doing plenty of dissemination of the report to people who are interested. So do get in touch if you're wanting to follow anything up with us. I'm very happy to talk further about the research. Thank you to Aberdeen Fairness Foundation for funding the research, and thank you to Entitled To for, as Rita said, making available the website to be able to approach claimants of council tax reduction. So thank you to Entitled To as well. But once again, thanks to Rita and Marsha, and do stay in touch with the work of the Institute for Policy Research, as I say, and we'll see you all again soon. Thanks very much.